I had already survived two assassination attempts. One of them happened in early 2018, and the other one happened towards the end of 2018. A 15-year-old kid who went out to the streets to offer water to the people who were peacefully protesting, and one sniper shot him in the throat. And his friends from high school recorded when he was saying, "I cannot breathe." The regime feels that they won because they have been placing one police officer or member of the party in every single church at the time of the mass.
Before we hear from Felix, the only thing I ask if you would like to support this channel is to press subscribe. Now, on to the podcast. Hello, I welcome you to my podcast. Today, my guest is Félix Maradiaga. I probably just got his last name wrong, but he's going to go ahead and introduce himself and he can correct me. Go ahead and take the floor, Felix.
Thank you, Cassandra, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you for your flexibility. You reached me through X, formerly Twitter, and it took a while to find a time. So I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to be in this podcast. My name is Felix Maradiaga, or as we say in Spanish, Félix Maradiaga, and the Spanish accent changes a little bit on the pronunciation. So you can just call me Felix or Felix. I'm born and raised in Nicaragua. I'm the result, as many other Nicaraguans, of the long struggle for peace in a country that for the last 50 years has been struggling in this journey between civil conflict and reconciliation and post-conflict reconstruction, and unfortunately, over the last few years, a dictatorship that took Nicaragua, as we will speak later in the podcast, again into this painful journey of exile. So now I'm in exile again. And what can I also say? I'm a Catholic. I have a wonderful wife, and we have an interfaith marriage. She's a Southern Baptist, and I'm a Catholic, and we that's why we believe so much in religious freedom. We decided to raise our daughter with Jesus at the center of our family, and we believe that when you have that understanding of the centrality of faith, many of the conflicts can be turned into dialogue because the Word of God provides what we believe as a family into a wonderful platform of understanding in the common values of human dignity. And I welcome this podcast as an opportunity, as we will talk later on, um, to showcase what happens when we have the lack of tolerance and lack of religious freedom, such as the one that is happening in Nicaragua now.
Okay. So, just a little bit more about your personal history. You were born in Nicaragua and then you spent a little bit of time in America as a child, I believe. So, can you just elaborate a little bit your relationship with America? Then you went back and then you came back. So, just a little bit more about that.
Yes. So I was born in 1976 in Nicaragua, in the middle of the war. The regime at the time was the Somosa regime, and there was, of course, as many other parts of Latin America, a struggle within the emerging Marxist movements, liberation theology, the Cold War, and other, military regimes that were closer to the U.S. In 1979, the Sandinistas took power, and Somoza was ousted out of the country, and Nicaragua went into down into a path of authoritarianism that was even worse than the previous regime. I don't think that any type of dictatorship is better than the other, but in a very objective assessment of our history, the Sandinista era that started in July 1979 was one of expropriation of private property, lack of religious freedom. The Sandinista regime tried to impose a new vision of Catholicism. There was a distortion of the faith, the so-called liberation theology. And my mother was caught at the center of this struggle, even though she was never political. She's not political, but she was raised Catholic. In fact, she was training to become a nun before she met my father. And my mother, after my father passed away in 1985 out of natural causes in an accident, didn't want me to be raised in the context of Marxism and Sandinismo. And she took the most difficult decision a mother could make. And she tried to get a U.S. visa for me. She could not get it. She tried to get a Canadian visa, and she was unsuccessful as well. So at age 12, I became part of the first wave of unaccompanied minors from Central America that were escaping civil war. At the time, many of my cousins and my relatives and close friends were fighting either for the Sandinistas or for the Contras. So I was both escaping the indoctrination of Sandinistas, but also the civil war. I was able to reach the border between Mexico and the US. I was with a group of adults from Central America, but I was not with any family members. So when I presented myself voluntarily to the United States authorities at the border, they placed me at a refugee center. And a few months later, through my mother, who was in Nicaragua, and the authorities, a foster parent was found for me, and I moved to Miami for 2 years. In 1990, the war, the Contra war, was over. And after 2 years in the United States, I wanted to go back. So I immediately went back to Nicaragua to do my best to help in the reconstruction of the country. I was only 15 years old. And the principal of my school, who is now a cardinal of the Catholic Church, offered me to become the co-founder of the what was called the Pastoral Juvenil, the Pastoral Youth. And that opened a door for a long, long uh, uh, um, episode of my life in peace building, in nonviolence. So for the last 2 years of high school, I worked in the former communities that were, the theater of war. So in the communities
Mm-hmm.
that just a few years before, and by this time it was already 1994. So just 4 years before, these communities in northern Nicaragua were destroyed by war, and I volunteered there. A few years later, I finished college, and I came back to those same communities. This time, not as a Catholic missionary, but this time as a member of the new government that was trying to rebuild those areas and demobilize combatants, demobilize former guerrillas. Um, and I volunteered for 3 months. It's very interesting. It was 1997. I volunteered what I thought was going to be 3 months working in these communities. You may not recognize these names, and most Nicaraguans would not recognize these names,
Mm-hmm.
but communities such as Huaslala, Cuscahuas, Ayapal, so indigenous communities that were destroyed by war. I was supposed to go to graduate school after 3 months, but these communities uh, touched my heart in such a profound way, in a combination of their need for the message, for the word of God, for spirituality, but also for healing after the war. And my job was to find ways to help them recover. For example, many amputees who had suffered, many of them civilians, the loss of their limbs, the lower limbs, through anti-personnel mines and explosives. So I did that for my first year, and I ended up staying. I didn't go to graduate school. I stayed for
Mm-hmm.
almost 10 years, and that was my first part of my life. And I can tell you
Mm-hmm.
more about the second part of my life after
Mm-hmm.
10 years. Um, I eventually moved up the ladder of the government, becoming the Secretary General of the Ministry of Defense, in charge
Mm-hmm.
of post-conflict reconstruction, disarmament, and the peace treaties, and also working with international organizations doing similar work in post-conflict reconstructions around the world. That's probably a long introduction, so I apologize
Mm-hmm.
for that. You're gonna need to
No.
stop me, because that part of my life is probably the most meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of my life that I'm very proud, a
Mm-hmm.
very misunderstood part of my life, because it's not a a sexy public service, so to speak, in the middle of the
Right.
jungles, trying to rebuild communities destroyed
Mm-hmm.
by war. um, but I think that many of the things that I do today, and many of my commitments, and my mission, is deeply connected to that first episode in Nicaragua.
Hmm. Yeah, it's important because you're also intertwining the history of the country within your own personal story. So that was after, so that you said that was 10 years. And then what happened after that?
I mentioned the Sandinistas who um, they overthrow the Somosa regime in 1979. They ruled the country from 1979 to 1990. I repeat this for our lovely American audience that might not
Hmm.
have all these details. In
Right.
1990, the Sandinistas accepted to have free and fair elections, which were the first elections in our history. And we had
Hmm.
Violeta Chamorro winning the elections in 1990. And that's where we started the peace process, the disarmament, the post-conflict reconstruction, what some of us in Nicaragua call the triple transition. It was a transition from Marxism to free markets. It was a transition from war to peace, and it was a transition as well from the Sandinista state into a new form of democratic regime and trying to build peace. So
Hmm.
this experiment lasted 16 years. I worked in the Nicaraguan government from 1997 to 2006. In 2006, the Sandinistas won the elections. Some of us may disagree if they won or not.
Hmm.
That's a long conversation on electoral transparency and electoral fraud, on rigged elections.
Hmm.
But the objective fact about this is that the Sandinistas came back into power after winning the elections in November 2006. They came back into power in January 2007. And at that time, I didn't feel that I could continue in public service. Although I was not a politician, I was a technical expert on
Hmm.
disarmament and post conflict reconstruction. So I took a path and pursued graduate studies abroad, and also decided to build a little bit of savings after 10 years in public service in a third
Hmm.
world country. You may
Hmm.
imagine that, of course, I had no savings. So I decided
Hmm.
to do a combination of academic work and private consulting for the next 8 years. So I worked in a combination of consulting firms in the area of geopolitics, and also do some academic training. Um, and by 2016, things in Nicaragua had deteriorated really, really fast.
Hmm.
Uh, I remained most of that time between 2007 and 2016 in Nicaragua, but I worked in about 55 different countries around the world, working
Hmm.
for global consulting firms and doing some other work, including work in China, in South Africa, in Senegal, which gave me the opportunity to see that many of the open wounds of Nicaragua were not unique to Nicaragua. They were very similar
Hmm.
to the wounds that many societies that have gone through civil conflict have, and trying to tackle questions on how to rebuild the infrastructure of a country. Do you do it through renewable energy, or do you do it through traditional energy systems? How do you rebuild your education system? How do you deal with your veterans? How do you do with your monetary policy? So it was very comprehensive,
Hmm.
diverse, interdisciplinary experience. But in 2016, a group of friends um, persuaded me to accept to go into politics in Nicaragua. So I decided to do a soft transition and reinsertion into politics. So I went to Nicaragua and accepted the position as the head of a think tank in Nicaragua that was called IEPP, which means the Institute for Strategic Studies and Public Policy. And this institute played a major role along other organizations in civil society in what 2 years later was going to be the massive protest of 2018.
Hmm.
Little did I imagine, or did I know, that the dictator Ortega, after the massive protest that started in 2018, was going to blame not only my think tank but me personally, as
Hmm.
what he argued, a sort of uh, uh, mastermind behind of what they label as a coup d'état, and this basically opened the doors of what I would define as the third chapter of my life, which broadly defined, it's, I would say, a human rights defender and someone who has been working alongside many other Nicaraguans in trying to recover our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just to back up a little bit, because I want you to talk about that third chapter as well. Uh, can you explain just the difference for an American audience that may not be familiar with the difference between what it means to live under a dictatorship to a democracy? So just like a few key differences, like religious
Oh,
freedom
there
you had
there there
mentioned.
are many, and
Mm-hmm.
a simple one is that in dictatorship, we would not be able to have this conversation. Uh, uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, as a journalist, as a podcaster, as an influencer, it would be impossible in dictatorship to even have this conversation unless you were
Mm-hmm.
in exile, and it's as is in fact the case of many Nicaraguan journalists who have been forced into exile. Living in
Mm-hmm.
a dictatorship means that you have no freedom to elect your authorities. It means that you have no free speech. It means that you have no freedom of religion. It means that you are persecuted as a dissident. It means that you become a political prisoner for trying to face the dictator, even in his own terms, as I did, trying to become a presidential candidate, even under the
Mm-hmm.
terms of Ortega, because I wanted to show the world and show Nicaraguans that Ortega could not win elections, not even
Mm-hmm.
under his own rules. And
Mm-hmm.
what happened is that Ortega came back into power for the second time, as I said,
Mm-hmm.
in 2007. And this in itself is a reminder for democracies. Democracy and freedom is not free. Democracy can erode, as unfortunately it has been happening around the world. As a trustee at Freedom House, which, by the way, is an organization that has been studying and also promoting freedom for 84 years. We have
Mm-hmm.
been measuring the freedom in the world through the Freedom in the World report for now 50 years, almost 50 years. And we've never seen a wave, such a sustained wave of erosion of democracy. For the last 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
we've been in a democratic backsliding. So today, only 1 out of 5 people in the world live in a fully free society. The other 4 out of the 5 people in the world, which means that 80% of the world lives in either an autocracy or dictatorship, or in something that political scientists call a hybrid regime. Hybrid regimes are those that are not a full dictatorship. So you have certain signs of democracy. Some people call it competitive autocracies. For example, you may have a couple of newspapers. So you may
Mm-hmm.
have one opposition party that may not be able to win elections because they're not allowed to compete freely, but they could
Mm-hmm.
have, let's say, a couple of regions of the country in which they are allowed to function. You may have some universities that allow students to at least protest in certain way, and you may have some flexibility within the judicial system to fight your case in court. Those are hybrid regimes. In the case
Mm-hmm.
of Nicaragua, it's a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's like total control by the government of many facets of life, where in a democracy, you have a lot more freedom, for example, in America. Yeah. Okay. So do you want to go into that third part of your life now after you entered
Well,
back into politics?
yes. So a quick recap: the first chapter of my life, it's my background growing up in Nicaragua in times of war and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
My childhood as a refugee in the United States and going back to Nicaragua to try to rebuild the country and give a little bit of my uh, contribution to
Mm-hmm.
that peace building. The second episode, it's my role after my public service as an academic, as a consultant, as an entrepreneur. And the third chapter is when I took the leap of faith and asked myself a question: what can I do in terms of public service? What's my role
Mm-hmm.
in trying to help Nicaragua recover its its democracy? Even though we
Mm-hmm.
never uh, became a full, vibrant democracy, these 16 years, once again, between 1990 and 2006, were years in which we had rebuilding free markets. Those were years in which we had uh, uh, pri- private and public education becoming an important part of public policy. We had efforts to go beyond the conflicts among Nicaraguans and try to heal the nation. But certainly Nicaraguans, including myself, didn't do a good job. The Sandinistas came back into power because there was still a lot of poverty. Democracy did not deliver the promises that people were expecting, which is an eye opening lesson that
Mm-hmm.
democracy cannot be only abstract principles. Democracy has to be expressed in very concrete terms in the livelihoods of people, in terms of income, in terms of a robust middle class, in terms of opportunity, in terms of what I believe in meritocracy and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that I could do a contribution. So this third chapter meant creating a movement, opening a foundation, Nicaraguan Freedom Foundation, becoming one of the main opposition leaders alongside other very talented and brave Nicaraguan individuals, and try to put together an expression of democracy, which was the first primary elections in the country, in order to show the people that we could build a democratic umbrella movement. And I was appointed as the candidate within the primaries by my own movement, the Blue and
Mm-hmm.
White National Unity Movement. There were other very interesting colleagues who were also trying to run for office. And this by this time, as you may remember from what I just mentioned a few minutes ago, in April 2018, we had massive protests against Ortega, and he responded to those protests with severe violence. He killed close to 400 people,
Mm-hmm.
55 of them university students, all of them participating in nonviolent protests. So we were going to have these primary elections in the context of all this violence. And as part of the nonviolent movement, we thought that these efforts of unifying the opposition and
Mm-hmm.
organizing through nonviolent tactics was the way to go. And Ortega was afraid. He was afraid to compete. His facade was down. He, for years and
Mm-hmm.
years, he was arguing that the opposition could not organize, that we could not win elections. So what he did is something unprecedented, at least in Latin American history. I'm sure that probably I'm sure that in the world we have not seen something like that, which is a dictator arresting the totality of all the presidential candidates in an opposition primary. So some of
Mm-hmm.
the candidates were sent into house arrest. Some of us were sent into a maximum security prison, and I spent the next 21 months in extreme inhumane conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that time, the first few months in solitary confinement. Then I was moved to other prison cell, but all the time it was a windowsless cell. It was a cell. My family was never allowed to visit me, with the exception of my sister, that was allowed to talk to me every 50 days for a few minutes, with the presence of a police officer. By that time, it's something that I skipped, for matters of time. But
Mm-hmm.
that time, when I was already in prison, I had already survived two assassination attempts. One of them
Wow.
happened in early 2018, and the other one happened towards the end of 2018. And after those two assassination attempts, one of them created a lot of physical damage. I decided to uh, evacuate my family to the United States. So we came as a family to the United States. This was in late 2018. And I used a few months to recover and to travel the world, to tell the world about what was happening in Nicaragua. This is, of course, a footnote of what I said before. This was before my arrest.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back to Nicaragua despite the fact that I had an arrest warrant. And that's what actually happened. So I went back to Nicaragua, launched my presidential campaign. I ended up in prison. And an important part of that, a fundamental part of that, is not only the suffering, it's not only the inhumane treatment, it's the fact that we never had reading or writing materials. We never had access to a lawyer. It was a windowsless cell, as I repeat. even the daily quota of water, because it was not, the water inside the cell was not viable for human consumption. Um, Even the daily quota of water was used as a mechanism of inhumane treatment. But the main thirst that I had as a prisoner was the Word of God. And I asked through a sort of encrypted message that I sent my wife through my sister that I wanted a Bible, and the Bible was never allowed in the cell. So my wife started the international campaign, A Bible for Felix. This campaign, I believe, touched the hearts of many, many people. She testified in Congress about this. Now, the A Bible for Felix movement has turned into the Nicaraguan Religious Freedom Movement. It was a program that we have that it's beyond just asking for a Bible for political prisoners. And due to the relentless work of my wife and other family members, after 21 months in prison, the Ortega regime believed that we were too much of a trouble, in prison, and he
Mm-hmm.
accepted to release the prisoners. Our family members demanded that it was not only the presidential candidates that had to be released, but all the prisoners. And on February 9, 2023, not only the presidential candidates, which were about five of us, but 222 political prisoners in total were released. But it was not full freedom. We were expelled and deported from
Mm-hmm.
Nicaragua to the US. And in an extraordinary act of humanity and solidarity, the US government accepted 222 prisoners that came in a flight that was sent by State Department. When we landed in the United States on February of 2023, so that's about 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
we learned that in that 4 hours that it took from Managua to Washington D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
the regime had created this mock congressional meeting to reform the Constitution, and also they arranged for a meeting of the Nicaraguan Supreme Court, all of them fully controlled, both the court and the legislative, by the dictator Ortega, and they
Mm-hmm.
declared the 222 prisoners plus 94 other Nicaraguans, including my wife,
Mm-hmm.
stateless. And they took away all our
Wow.
properties and they declared civil death. What does that mean? It
My
meant that
goodness.
our names had to be erased from the Nicaraguan records. So, for example, prisoners who are lawyers, their titles were canceled. Prisoners who were medical doctors, their medical degrees were canceled. Prisoners who were accountants, their CPA license were canceled. Driver's license, medical records, records from primary school, birth certificates, and even the certificates in which, and this is an example of how extreme the Ortega regime is. Some of
Mm-hmm.
the people that came in that flight had left behind their children, their wife, and these arbitrary act of statelessness meant that the parents could not ask for their children because their birth certificates were canceled, and Ortega did not recognize any of these parents now in exile as Nicaraguans are therefore without any civil rights. So
Mm-hmm.
we have been working very hard nonstop to reunite the families of Nicaraguans who were forced into exile.
Wow, that's incredible. So the can you also just share who's the president? You keep saying Ortega. The president, there's also the vice president, which I think is his wife. Just what are their first and last names?
Well, Daniel Ortega, it's the dictator of
Okay.
Nicaragua, and just a few months ago,
Mm-hmm.
the dictatorship reformed the Nicaraguan constitution to create this very, very strange system in
Mm-hmm.
which his wife, whose name is Rosario Murillo,
Mm-hmm.
is the co-president. So now we have the alleged co-presidents. But if you No, I don't refer to any of them as presidents. I refer to them as
Mm-hmm.
dictators because
Mm-hmm.
they are not the result of a legitimate election. They are not the result of any legal process. They are
Mm-hmm.
violators even of their own constitution. They had to invent and create this constitution that was not even approved through the ordinary process. So what we have in Nicaragua, it's one of the closest regimes in the world. Ortega controls the military. They control the police. They've sent every single member of the senior member of the opposition into either exile or prison. So
Mm-hmm.
about 2,200 people over the last 7 years have gone through prison. Right now, there are about 100 people in prison in Nicaragua,
Mm-hmm.
and they control 100% of the municipalities, so all the city councils and all the other positions in the Nicaraguan state. It's a totalitarian state.
Right. Yeah. And what governments around the world are supporting Nicaragua?
Mostly China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. And more recently,
Mm-hmm.
Belarus has signed a treaty with Nicaragua. Ortega has deep, deep anti-American sentiments. Basically, Daniel Ortega, it's a relic of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
He was a young guerrilla Marxist fighter in the late 70s who ruled Nicaragua during the first Nicaraguan first dictatorship. I personally believe that even in the 80s, the Sandinistas established a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in the 1980s, it was a very controversial time. It was a civil war. Some Americans may recall, for example, the so-called Iran Contra, because the Contras, which were the fighters who fought against Sandinistas, received support from the Reagan administration. So the issue of the 1980s was very controversial around the world. The
Mm-hmm.
Sandinistas had a massive propaganda machine trying to present themselves as David against Goliath, being
Mm-hmm.
Goliath, the West and the US, and the Sandinistas as these idealist young revolutionaries. Well, actually, they were always puppets of the Soviets. They were always puppets
Mm-hmm.
of the Cuban Communist Party. And it's very sad that a lot of people around the world with good intentions believe that the Sandinistas were actually well intentioned. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what I insisted over and over again, that Ortega drop his facade, because now he's exactly what he has always been,
Mm-hmm.
someone that has committed genocide, someone that has committed acts of severe violation against the Nicaraguan people, even crimes against humanity.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, the United Nations, through the UN Expert Group on Nicaragua, uh, published this extraordinary report in which they unequivocally report, and by they I mean the independent group of experts, that Ortega and his wife, alongside the military and the police and their cronies, committed crimes against humanity.
Wow. That's wild. And have you seen the dictatorship of Ortega get more extreme or tighten the grip more over the years to maintain power?
As any other authoritarian regimes, there is a sort of a trade-off between, we may call it the carrot and the stick, you know. So not all autocracies in their different forms, totalitarian regimes or more authoritarian regimes, not all of them want to use force. They ideally
Mm-hmm.
want to keep the people numb. They ideally want to keep the people complacent with their regime.
Mm-hmm.
And authoritarian regimes are becoming very sophisticated. There's a dictator's learning curve in which they learn methods of repression, but also something that one of my colleagues calls the tyranny of the algorithm. Through social media,
Mm-hmm.
dictatorships are able to present these idea that authoritarianism works to control crime. That authoritarianism is more efficient than democracies, and Ortega is not different at that. By that I mean that the first years of his second term,
Mm-hmm.
uh, he was able to manipulate large parts of the private sector, particularly chronic capitalists that saw in Ortega an opportunity to make big deals with China, big deals
Mm-hmm.
with Russia. He offered a lot of promises to corporations that wanted to work with Ortega in big contracts. So he used that narrative. And
Mm-hmm.
also, he used the mistakes, which I acknowledge, of previous democratic governments. It's very important to highlight and to be very candid and very open that democracies are not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Democracies are, as we know, a competitive process that is based on elections, but elections is not, it's not all. So elections cannot resolve every single social problem. So
Right.
Ortega used many of the unfulfilled promises of democracy in these 16 years I mentioned, from 1990 to 2006. So, for example, the need of the people for more social inclusion, whether true or not, the lack of a better healthcare system, the lack of a direct money transfers to particular sectors of the population that felt
Mm-hmm.
left behind, uh, and also corruption. There were some corrupt members of the democratic era, and he used that in the first years of his regime. However, by 2018, the Nicaraguan people felt that it was already enough, and there was a fire on a natural reserve called Indio Maiz on early 2018, and a small group of environmentalists protested against the fire, and they
Mm-hmm.
were met with violence. And within that same week, it was the first week of April 2018, the Sandinista regime approved a reform of the pension system
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, that was very severe on the savings of people who had already retired. So many of what we call in Nicaragua our grandmothers and our grandfathers, our
Mm-hmm.
abuelitos, went out to the streets, and the police, which tells you that regimes get comfortable with their power. Um, they were facing the environmental protests, and they were facing the protests of the member of retired people in Nicaragua, and
Mm-hmm.
both with met with severe violence. And with we Nicaraguans looked into the first images of people in their 70s being beaten by the police, that triggered a response. It touched a nerve of particularly the Nicaraguan youth. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
students came out to the streets in solidarity both of the environmental movement and in solidarity to people who were protesting for the abuse with their pensions. And that's where the killings started. And there was
Mm-hmm.
one in particular that touched Nicaraguans deeply, was the death, the assassination of Álvaro Conrado, a 15-year-old kid who went out to the streets to offer water to the people who were peacefully protesting, and
Mm-hmm.
one sniper shot him in the throat. And his friends from high school recorded when he was saying, "I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe. It hurts to breathe." And he was rushed into the hospital. And the Minister of Health, uh, following Daniel Ortega's orders, instructed every single public hospital in Nicaragua not to provide medical care to any of the wounded. And Alvaro Conrado died on the waiting room of that hospital saying, "It hurts to breathe." And that phrase triggered a massive protest. I was already a community organizer, a
Mm-hmm.
public intellectual, and I tried to offer my support in strategy and to raise awareness internationally. So one of the things that I
Mm-hmm.
immediately did was to document through my team, my volunteers, everything that
Mm-hmm.
was happening. I offered my services to the international community in documented these cases, and became the first Nicaraguan to testify at the UN Security Council that same year, September 2018. And after that, basically Ortega issued a death sentence against me for documented these crimes. I must say that it was not only me. There were many other organizations And the interesting thing about this is that Nicaraguans have always been, and this is a sad part of our history, a country divided because of our very difficult history. So we're a
Mm-hmm.
country divided ethnically, we're different ethnic groups, a country divided economically. There's massive economic inequality in the country, a country divided by language. So we have the Afro Caribbean identity of those who were, in a way, colonized by the British in the Caribbean, and the more Spanish and culture and mestizo
Mm-hmm.
culture of the Pacific. We're also, in a way, divided by different faiths. So we have the Moravian Church in the Caribbean, the Catholic and the Evangelical Church, and the Protestant tradition in the Pacific. Um, but for the first time, Nicaraguans became one, and that's what we call this massive movement, the blue and white, because for the first time we saw evangelicals, Moravians, Catholics, young students, progressive activists from different environmental groups or
Mm-hmm.
feminist groups, alongside the conservatives, alongside the faith-based groups like myself and many others, all of
Mm-hmm.
us working together, walking together in the street, non-violently. And this brings me to an important topic: the moral authority
Mm-hmm.
of the Nicaraguan Catholic Church. Because by that time, Nicaraguans did not believe, and I think that up until today, we do not believe in traditional political parties. Our heart, so to speak, as citizen, has been
Mm-hmm.
broken many times and disappointed by traditional politicians. So this massive blue and white movement became almost as a spiritual cry for peace,
Mm-hmm.
for justice, for freedom, and a couple of names such as Monsignor Silvio Baez,
Mm-hmm.
the Archbishop of Managua, and the Bishop of my own diocese in Matagalpa, Rolando Alvarez, alongside other incredibly inspiring religious figures in the country, became the voice of the nation, not from a
Mm-hmm.
political point of view, but from the point of view of human dignity and human rights. And that triggered a cruel, massive response from the regime, the Ortega regime, that turned the Catholic Church into its objective. And he has been
Right.
trying ever since to destroy the Nicaraguan Catholic Church.
Yes, that was like exactly what I wanted to get into was you mentioned the makeup of the country. So if you could break up in terms of religion, if you could break up each religion or Christian religion in Nicaragua, how would you break them up? Like 80% is Catholic, or how would you break them up in Nicaragua?
It's very hard to give objective
Okay.
numbers because there are different measures, but there's no
Mm-hmm.
question that Nicaragua, it's mostly a Catholic country in terms of
Okay.
percentage. So the Catholic, we used to be a officially Catholic country until 1893, when we had a constitution that opened the doors for other expressions of faith.
Mm-hmm.
92%, 98% of Nicaraguans define
Mm-hmm.
themselves as Christians, as believers.
Wow.
So only 2% are either agnostic or atheists, and the rest are either, well, Catholics, of course. That's the and also there is, in the Caribbean part of Nicaragua, there is a church called the Moravian Church. We had missionaries of the Moravian Church in the Caribbean coast, but the Catholic Church is by far the strongest.
Now the question is, what exactly or when did the pursuit after the Christian or Catholics start by the Ortega regime, and how has that been since
The,
it started?
as I always insisted, the Sandinistas have always tried to take control of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, as I just mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
is the largest single organized religion in Nicaragua. Uh, they have a strong
Mm-hmm.
influence in the history of the country, not only because of our Spanish heritage and the history of Nicaragua
Mm-hmm.
as a whole, but also because of the moral authority of the church. The church has invested a lot in education, the
Mm-hmm.
Catholic education system in Nicaragua, both for the Nicaraguans of higher income, but also for Nicaraguans without opportunity, is very important. I am myself a product of the Catholic
Mm-hmm.
education, and I don't come from the elites. So the Catholic Church it has been the moral voice of Nicaragua, the unifying factor of our identity in many, many ways, with all due respect to other expressions of faith,
Mm-hmm.
particularly by our brothers and sisters of the other Protestant churches. Um, and that's very uncomfortable for an
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian regime. So in the 1990s, they tried to hijack the church through a message that was a complete misinterpretation of the gospel, something called liberation theology. His Holiness John Paul II was very, very open in his criticism against this so-called liberation theology as a corruption
Mm-hmm.
of the real message of the gospel. For
Mm-hmm.
those of you who have not heard about liberation theology, broadly speaking, of course, it's more complex than that. Is the whole idea that Jesus came to liberate humanity from capitalist oppression, basically. So it's a sort of a materialistic
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of freedom, which, as we know, those of us who
Mm-hmm.
define ourselves as Catholics and Christian, is liberation from sin. It's liberation in a
Mm-hmm.
spiritual sense. And of course, we all care about ending poverty. Absolutely, yes, but not in the way that liberation theology was trying to use that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm using that example just to illustrate that the Sandinistas always wanted to corrupt the church. They tried and they were able to seduce some members of the church into becoming members of the Sandinista party in the 80s, but
Mm-hmm.
they failed. They were only able to attract a very small part of the Catholic Church. Then, when they came back into power in 2007, they tried to use the massive amount of money that they had received mostly through Venezuela. In 2007, the oil prices in Venezuela were at the peak, and Hugo Chavez, the dictator of Venezuela, was
Mm-hmm.
in power, and he became key in helping Ortega go into power. So Venezuela, Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, and Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua were very close. So Ortega used a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars, that came from Venezuela to basically bribe members of the private sector, to bribe members of the press, to bribe members of the church. And once again, he was not successful. He was only able to attract a fraction,
Mm-hmm.
non representative section of the Catholic Church. So he was not able to do that through these means, and that's why he moved to another more perverse method, which is basically outright persecution, prison, and assassination attempts, smear campaigns. His main objective were some of the senior members of the church, particularly Bishop Alvarez, Bishop Paez, Bishop Mora, and Bishop Herrera from another diocese. But about 400 religious leaders were persecuted, sent into exile. 11 religious orders, including Mother Teresa's missionary group, were expelled from Nicaragua. Uh, 26 universities were shut down, many of them Catholic universities, including the main seminary was shut down.
Wow.
And now in my own diocese, just to show you or to give you a number, about 70% of my own diocese it's in exile.
You mean people or priests and bishops?
Priests, we're talking about priests, bishops, members of the clergy, and also people who worked for the diocese.
Wow, that's crazy. So you said it started like kind of 80s, 90s. Did I get that right? 80s, 90s?
Well, I said from
90s. Okay.
1979 to
Okay.
1980, they used these same methods of repression. But
Okay.
after 2018, remember that Ortega has been in power twice in the
That's
in the in the
right.
10 years of the civil war, during the Contra war and the Sandinista revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and then he came back into power in 2007. And a lot of I say this because a lot of people think it's a new phenomenon. It's not. Ortega has always hated the
Right.
church. The thing is that he dropped his facade. He tried to do it through different methods. After 2018, for the first time in Nicaraguan history, he imprisoned bishops. He imprisoned religious leaders. He shut down seminaries, and he has expropriated the main Jesuit university, Universidad Centroamericana, so the UCA University, and now, according to some conservative estimates, about $300 million in assets, and that's only a very modest estimate of the Catholic Church assets have been expropriated.
Wow. So is this buildings or cash?
This is both.
All of it.
This is both. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And I know Archbishop or Bishop Silvio Baez, he's here in America, but there was the other bishop that you had mentioned that got imprisoned, and he was also just recently released. He's in exile as well?
Yes. So Archbishop Silvio Baez was forced into exile. So he was the first of the bishops that was forced into exile before being arrested, and I think there was a clear assassination
Hmm.
attempt against him. So uh, the church evacuated Bishop Baez. Uh, Later, Bishop Alvarez from the Diocese of Matagalpa, my hometown, was sent into prison for more than a year. And then he
Wow.
was expelled. So Bishop Baez, it's in the United States, and Bishop Alvarez is at the Vatican. And there are two other bishops, Bishop Mora from the Caribbean coast, and Bishop Herrera, that at this point he is in Honduras. So we have four bishops in exile.
Wow. And for such a small country, too. What is it, 8 million people in Nicaragua?
It's less than 8 million, about 7 million
Wow.
people. But now
Yeah,
we
small
have
country.
close to 20% of Nicaraguans in exile.
Wow. Amazing. So, what now is this status of the Catholic Church and even just Christians? What's the status of what's going on with them now with
Well,
Ortega?
thank you for opening the question, because I would also like to highlight the fact that the Protestant Church and many evangelical denominations are also persecuted, not to the level of the Catholic Church, because the unity of the Catholic Church,
Right.
its history, structure, and the fact that it's the majority make it a bigger, a
Target.
target for Ortega. But
Hmm.
Ortega has been using bending the Nicaraguan laws to try to force the appointment of pastors. So, in other words, a pastor from a particular church needs to be vetted by the Sandinista party and by the structures of the regime. And some churches, and I'm speaking specifically of evangelical churches, mostly
Hmm.
the Pentecostal movement, that, as we know, it's very plural, very diverse. Some of them have decided to play by those rules as a survival strategy, but those pastors, and there are many, many of them that have not accepted those impositions, have gone into prison. So there are many evangelical pastors that have gone into prison and are forced into exile. And more recently, the Moravian Church, that is a church that is common on the Caribbean part of the country, is
Hmm.
also suffering persecution.
Wow, incredible. And I guess it's continuing today. Are arrests of Christians and pastors and Catholic priests and stuff like that still continuing, or is
the
it slow?
current the
Hmm.
current state, it's a police state, and this has been going for 7 years. Every year there's a report that we published alongside the International
Hmm.
Religious Freedom Summit, and the report that we presented this year highlighted the fact that there are no more bishops in prison, no more high-ranking members of the church in prison,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that the persecution has stopped. In fact, the regime feels that they won, because they have been placing one police officer or member of the party in every single church at the time of the mass. And
Wow.
before the priest delivers his homily, uh, the message, it's monitored by the regime, and this, it's a controversial, sensitive, and painful issue, because even within the Catholic community, some people believe that the Holy See and His Holiness in particular should be more outspoken. The fact is that Pope Francis was very outspoken at the beginning, and every time there was a statement by the Vatican, there were 26, if I recall correctly, 22 or 26 statements by official statements by the
Hmm.
Vatican. Ortega would respond by expropriating a new building, or by shutting down a new religious order, or by expelling a new a missionary group. And as I discussed, off the record with some members of the church, and I need to say this very openly, that I understand that argument, because I agree with it. I do not only understand, I agree. The mandate, the role, the mission of the church is the mission of the gospel, the mission of service, the pastoral mission.
Mm-hmm.
And the church needs to continue to do their work even in the more oppressive regimes.
Mm-hmm.
And this requires the church to act very carefully. And so the fact that we're not seeing more statement and more Catholics in prison, at least high-ranking Catholics in prison, doesn't mean that the regime has stopped. It's the fact that they have been able to establish a police state that monitors not only the Nicaraguan Catholic Church and other Christians,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a method of full control. The Russians just established a massive system called the SORM system, which is a very sophisticated surveillance system
Mm-hmm.
that unites databases from police stations, from radio, from telecommunications, from internet. And it's massive system with the support of both the Russians and the Chinese, are able to do surveillance of social media, surveillance of phone calls, surveillance at every single level of Nicaragua. So Nicaraguans at this moment live under a police state.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely incredible. Wow. And then they're also being assisted by other dictatorships helping them. So it's like they're being sustained by the
Absolutely.
lifeblood of authoritarian regimes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Authoritarian regimes work together. They work as an ecosystem.
Right.
They work as a network of criminals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What do you see now? What is your current work to help Nicaragua? Like, what do you see now for the future? I mean, none of us could tell the future, but just what are your thoughts, I guess, about the future of Nicaragua, and just what is your current work? And I guess anything you want to share about where people can follow your work or how people can help, people in Nicaragua, Christians, Catholics, if they want to do something to help.
Well, in terms of my day job, which is deeply connected to my passion for freedom, democracy, and religious freedom
Mm-hmm.
broadly, I'm a professor of practice on global democracy at the University of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lovely university that has opened its doors for my research, for my work. I'm also a visiting faculty at Johns Hopkins University. So most of my work is research. Most of my work is training activists from around the world. We welcome dissidents. We welcome former political prisoners into our universities, in which we try to help them how to continue their work in exile.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I call freedom in exile, because for many years exile was basically a chapter of a dissident's life that meant that he or she had lost the
Mm-hmm.
battle. And now through technology, through the connectivity that we have today, exile means doesn't mean that that is the end. So a lot of our
Right.
work has to do in empowering dissidents from around the world
Mm-hmm.
in to continue their struggle. I do a lot of pro bono work with the World Liberty Congress. So you
Mm-hmm.
can look at the worldlibertycongress.org, training activists around the world. And more specifically on Nicaragua, I'm the founder of Nicaraguan Freedom Foundation. That means Fundación Libertad
Mm-hmm.
.org. You can just Google the word libertad.org, LIBERTAD
Mm-hmm.
.org. Sorry, uh, um, trying to switch
English,
languages
Spanish.
mentally. And you will find our foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Through our foundation, we do a couple of things. We do the technical work of supporting international human rights organizations to document what is happening in Nicaragua,
Mm-hmm.
and we do a lot of strategy work to give the Nicaraguan opposition, the Nicaraguan activists, the
Mm-hmm.
tools to continue to organize even from exile.
Mm-hmm. Oh, beautiful. Well, is there anything else you want to share, Felix, with the audience about anything about Nicaragua, or just about the Christians there, about the church, and
Yeah,
any
about
last
both.
words? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. So
Mm-hmm.
twofold from the perspective of a Nicaraguan. I think that the most important part is not to be forgotten. We are a small country that continues to struggle for freedom. So anything you could do to tweet. You can also look at my Twitter at Maradiaga. That's Maradiaga, Maradiaga in Twitter. I post most of my work there, and you can also find me on Facebook under the same name and LinkedIn. So just to highlight what we do, that's very important. And of course, as a person of faith, as a Catholic, as a Christian, as I believe in the power of prayer. So I thank you for before we had this a very interesting podcast. We had a moment of prayer, and I will ask any a person in the world who believes in the power of prayer to pray for the persecuted Church of Nicaragua.
Absolutely. And we will do that. I will continue to pray in any way I can help. Please let me know, if you want to come back in 6 months or a year and just highlight it again, the status of what's going on. And please, you're always welcome. So thank you, Felix.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. And to my audience, thank you so much for watching. If you do have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section. I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night, wherever you are in the world. And God bless you. Bye-bye.